Corporations advertise themselves as the change when they're really not changing a thing. Or they promise to take us back to the good old days when all they're really doing is pushing their profits forward. Either way, the message is the same. Why be the change when you can buy the change? And in this way, there's not much difference between a corporation and your average politician. Both advertise big promises to land our votes and our dollars, and both sell us out to keep their pockets fat and their power intact. Welcome to Marketing Muckraking, the show that asks not simply what brand culture can do for us, but what it's doing to us. With your host, creative director, and brand strategist gone wild, Rachel K. Albers, making fun of business and making business fun. This is the show for rebels, revolutionaries, and renegades who run businesses that burn the rulebook. If you're sick of business podcasts that have all the answers, well, I got nothing but questions. Let's go. Episode 24, should brands be political? Content warning. This episode contains references to homophobic and transphobic language. I also want to note that in this episode, I reference the term woke in the context of right-wing pundits appropriating this term for their go woke, go broke political agenda. It is important to note that the term woke originated in African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, going back to at least the 1930s. And in the last 10 years, after it was repopularized by the Black Lives Matter movement, it has gained widespread usage by white people because, well, we like to colonize stuff. On with the show. In June of 2023, the world's most powerful advertisers gathered at Cannes Lions. I hope I'm saying that right. I had to Google it before I hopped on this podcast, where this year's biggest themes included AI, ad tech, influencer marketing, and most notably, dialing down the politics, which was the directive to jurors voting on the world's top advertising awards. While the Cannes leadership never made a direct statement on the issue, it is hard not to see the jury instructions as a direct response to recent right-wing fueled culture wars, specifically as it relates to woke M&M's spokes candies, Bud Light's short-lived influencer deal with Dylan Mulvaney, and the backlash in response to Target's 2023 Pride line. But even without making a statement, the message from Cannes Lions leadership was loud and clear. Shut up and sell. And they really brought that home when they awarded their Marketer of the Year award to Anheuser-Busch's chief marketing officer. Yeah. That's right. After exploiting Dylan Mulvaney to gain market share and then dropping her into a sea of death threats and right-wing violence when their sales suffered, Anheuser-Busch won the top marketing award in the world for the second year, making history as the only brand to win this award twice in a row. And Dylan confirmed in late June that neither Bud Light nor Anheuser-Busch ever reached out to her after the backlash, which further confirms their stance towards the LGBTQIA+ community. We won't stand with you, but we will sell to you. Award-winning marketing here, folks. In the wake of what some call woke washing, otherwise known as rainbow capitalism, pinkwashing, or greenwashing, all terms synonymous with corporations positioning themselves as friendly to progressives, social and environmental causes, and historically excluded groups to gain market share, the growing efforts by right-wing extremists to make examples of brands with messages that they don't like have opened up conversations around whether brands should stay out of politics and stick to selling, as was the Cannes Lion directive to jurors. This is my bat signal. We need a muckraker on the scene, because if we leave it up to advertising apologists, well, they're just going to keep giving awards to hypocrites who care more about profits than people or the planet. And if we leave it up to whichever talking head is auditioning to replace Tucker Carlson, well, they're just going to keep inciting hate to promote their Make America Gilead Again agenda. So the question we are muckraking about today is, should brands be political? But before we can answer this, or not answer this, because you know my style, what does it mean for brands to be political? How do we define politics in this context? Now, if you're asking Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan's army of Andrew Tate-loving incels, political is defined as making a statement or taking a stand on any social or cultural issue that they want to weaponize to spread fear and gain votes.
Limited government, except when it's something we don't like. Am I right?
No, you're not. and you never will be. Funny how the same people saying that companies should stay out of politics have no problem when corporations market a patriotic message, even one that cheapens and mocks the very values they supposedly enshrine as sacred, huh? I'm publishing this episode right before the 4th of July, where the latest and greatest hits include "You Can't Spell Sausage Without USA" from Johnsonville Brats, or "The Right to Bear Cheeseburgers" from Sonic, whose ad says that the founding fathers fought for our freedom to gobble down ground beef. Okay. Not to mention how Tucker Carlson and Fox News applauded the launch of Jeremy's Razors by the CEO of the Daily Wire, specifically for being an activist brand championing a social message that they liked. This is probably not on your radar, and that is a compliment. So let me catch you up. The Jeremy's Razors brand, complete with tagline, "Shut up and shave," launched in 2022 in response to Harry's Razors dropping its ads at the Daily Wire because of homophobic and transphobic comments made on the streaming service. Here are some sound bites from a Jeremy's Razors ad that inexplicably passes the Fox News stay out of politics test.
Do you remember when there were two genders and only 1.5 of them had to shave their mustaches? Then they decided that men are too toxic. Unless you're the kind of man who teaches his daughter to shave her beard. If that makes sense to you, keep buying Gillette. Our country's in trouble. Conservatives are being canceled by Hollywood, the media, universities, and now Harry's Razors. Stop giving your money to woke corporations who don't think you deserve their product. Give it to me instead.
So let me get this right. When Fox News pundits say that companies should stay out of politics, what they mean is stay out of politics that threaten our agenda. Everyone else is cool, especially the MyPillow guy. But let's go back to our question. What does it mean for brands to be political? How do we define politics in this context? One answer is anytime a corporation shares a message with any sort of social, cultural, environmental commentary, period. But as we can see, the loudest in the go woke, go broke crowd have a very specific bias. They're actually cool with brands getting political in this context, as long as it's the politics of hate, bigotry, or just leveraging the founding fathers to sell cheeseburgers. You know what I mean? But what the Fox News pundits conveniently leave out of their Make America Great Again revisionist history is the fact that American brands have always been political in this way. In fact, in World War I and World War II, the government mandated that advertisers share very specific political messages to ensure that the American people supported the war effort. During World War I, the Committee on Public Information gave advertisers very specific instructions for what they could and couldn't say so that every American opened their newspaper each day to an identical, patriotic, upbeat wartime message. And as TV and ultimately internet technology evolved to make way for segmented programming targeted to different audiences and demographics instead of one mass market, advertisers have historically been the first to hop on the bandwagon of shifting culture to compete with one another for market share. What the right wing often signals as a very recent shift in woke marketing is not recent at all. Brands have been surfing the waves of wokeness before that term existed. Some to position themselves as the change the world needs, others to represent a return to a bygone time that never existed. And in both cases, this culture surfing almost always was and is performative. Corporations advertise themselves as the change when they're really not changing a thing. Or they promise to take us back to the good old days when all they're really doing is pushing their profits forward. Either way, the message is the same. Why be the change when you can buy the change? And in this way, there's not much difference between a corporation and your average politician. Both advertise big promises to land our votes and our dollars, and both sell us out to keep their pockets fat and their power intact. The second way that we can define brands getting political is when corporations donate to politicians or political action committees, influence elections, and lobby government to legislate in their best interest. This is the political brand standing that most people on both sides of the aisle and those protesting outside of the brand theater overtly disagree with. But let's be real, the majority of corporate brands are political according to both definitions. They advertise themselves as aligning with the change that the world needs while funding and lobbying politicians who oppose that very change. What a fun game this is. Round and round we go. Now, Bud Light, which has performatively and yet very profitably run pride campaigns for years, didn't simply partner with Dylan Mulvaney to grab up LGBTQIA plus market share and then drop her when sales dropped. In the past year alone, their parent company, Anheuser-Busch, has spent millions backing conservative politicians, most of which are pushing anti-gay legislation. And if you're thinking, well, Anheuser-Busch supports Democrats too, the actual breakdown of their political spending is 62% in favor of right-wing candidates versus 37% to Democrats and progressives. So you do the math. And Target didn't only release a pride line and then pull it when the going got tough. They have a long track record of contradicting their inclusive ad campaigns by financing family values politicians with platforms built on exclusion. For more on this, I have a TikTok on Target's extensive history of rainbow washing, which I'll link to in the show notes. So if the question of today's podcast is, should brands be political? I think we can agree that one answer is not like this, but there's a third definition here that complicates our co-muckraking. Would you expect anything less from RKA? If we only define brands getting political as one, taking a stand on social, cultural, or environmental issues, and two, funding and lobbying politicians to legislate in their best interest, we ignore the fact that corporate brands are political bodies in and of themselves. And here's what I mean by that. If we trace back the origin of the word politics, which comes from the Greek politika, meaning affairs of the cities, politics is, as Wikipedia defines, the set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relations among individuals, such as the distribution of resources or status. In other words, politics is just a fancy way of saying how people collectively make decisions about how to live together on the planet. In theory, we the people collectively make decisions about how to live together by voting for who will represent us in government. And then it is the job of the politicians we elect to make decisions on our behalf and in our best interest. But when corporations, whose leadership we didn't vote on, fund and lobby those same politicians to legislate in their best interest, our votes immediately lose their value. When it's profits versus people, profits always win. And you might be thinking, yeah, RKA, this is the case for keeping corporations out of politics. But that is easier said than done. And let me tell you why. Multinational corporations like Anheuser-Busch and Target aren't merely regulated by the United States government, because what one country forbids, another country welcomes, or more accurately, is forced to abide to survive economically. So, if the USA enforces strict environmental or labor laws, multinational corporations simply build factories in countries with looser regulations. And these corporate decisions directly and indirectly impact people here in the USA in terms of jobs, pollution, tax dollars, so much more. And yet we and the politicians we elect often have absolutely no say in the matter. In a globalized economy like the one that we're living in, corporations are political bodies. They make decisions that directly affect how people across the world live and how resources are allocated. And they can skirt regulations in any given country by taking their business operations elsewhere or threatening to. And here's the kicker. When they do violate laws that we, the people, have elected officials to enact and enforce, corporations can and do simply buy their way out of the consequences. Like Anheuser-Busch did in 2019 when it was found to be in violation of California's air quality laws. Anheuser-Busch knowingly broke the law and wagered that it was cheaper to pay a $500,000 fine than to lower emissions. In March of 2023, the Changing Markets Foundation published a report on corporate greenwashing, companies marketing themselves as environmentally friendly when their practices don't match the label. And this report described how Anheuser-Busch partnered with the nonprofit Climate Neutral to certify its Bud Light Next beer as carbon neutral. According to this report, to achieve this, they measured emissions associated with the supply chain of Bud Light Next and bought $50,250 of carbon credits. Climate Neutral claims the companies it works with must also reduce their own emissions, but although Anheuser-Busch has plans to reduce its emissions, no absolute reductions have been reported to date. But a carbon offset is not the same thing as being carbon neutral. In an article from Greenpeace entitled "The Biggest Problem with Carbon Offsetting is that it doesn't really work," the organization describes how a newly planted tree can take as many as 20 years to capture the amount of CO2 that a carbon offset scheme promises. Yet, just as corporations like Anheuser-Busch wager that it's cheaper to pay fines than follow environmental protection laws, they also bet on the idea that carbon neutral press will overshadow their actual company practices. And corporate profits depend on these types of wagers. This is the story of capitalism. When you have enough money, you can pick and choose which laws to abide by, knowing that your power, privilege, and profits will always afford you the ability to keep on keeping on. To put this in perspective, as of July 2023, Apple is valued at $3 trillion, making it the world's most valuable company by market cap. And if it were a country, it would be the world's 5th wealthiest nation. Amazon would be 17. Anheuser-Busch would be 68. Just one number away from giving me another bad Joe Rogan joke. Maybe we can push them down to 69. In this way, multinational corporations are not simply political bodies in and of themselves. They hold more power, wealth, and influence on world politics than our individual governments do. It's called corporate rule. And if you want to learn more about this phenomenon, I highly recommend checking out No Logo by Naomi Klein. Sadly, despite sending shockwaves through the world for exposing how brands had taken over every aspect of public and private life, not much has changed since the book's publication in 1999. When multinationals have more say and sway in human rights and environmental practices than the nations they do business in, every choice they make, from how they source their products to who makes them and for how much to how they're transported, packaged, sold, is a political one. And countries who try to regulate their harmful practices risk the economic damage of corporations pulling out and moving elsewhere. It is the ultimate damned if you do, damned if you don't paradox. Short-term economic losses versus long-term environmental damage and a deepening divide between the rich and the poor. What do you choose? For centuries, when faced with this dilemma, our politicians have ultimately sided with corporate interests while pushing off the long-term consequences onto future generations. But that future is now. We are living in it. We are breathing in its toxic air, drinking its polluted water. And yet, somehow, many of us still believe that capitalism will regulate itself, that corporations beholden to corporate interests can somehow save us in time. They haven't yet. What makes us think they will anytime soon? So, if we return to our question, should brands be political? And we define what political means in 3 ways. 1, taking a public stand on social, cultural, or environmental issues. 2, funding and lobbying politicians to legislate in their best interest. And 3, making decisions about how to organize and care for people and the planet. Then the answer is abundantly clear. No, brands/corporations should not be political. And yet, the reality is that they are. Every major decision that a corporation or mega brand makes is ultimately a political one. And there isn't a single government in the world with the power to stop them. Once we see how in a global capitalist economy, corporations are inherently political bodies, the question goes from, should brands be political, to is it even possible for brands not to be political? So for the sake of this question, let's imagine for a moment a world where brands did shut up and sell. A world where corporations completely withdraw from any cultural, social, environmental commentary and just focus on profits without any performances to distract from that single goal. In this world, the government would regulate corporations and ensure that they are doing what's right for people and paying their fair share of taxes, without any fear that a brand would pull their donations or funding to political action committees. Because, for the sake of this hypothetical, brands and corporations would be barred from donating to political candidates or lobbying in any way. And individuals receiving corporate benefits of any kind would also be unable to participate in government. So let's take this to its logical conclusion. In this world that I'm talking about, we are still living in a global capitalist economy. So when a government regulates corporate activity and ensures that companies aren't harming people in any way, this would impact profits. So that damned if you do, damned if you don't paradox still exists, forcing governments to choose between short-term economic losses versus long-term environmental damage and a deepening divide between the rich and the poor. Similarly, if the corporations were paying their fair share of taxes in this situation, there is further disincentive to enforce regulations that reduce tax contributions, which keeps the government running. You following me here? And in this globalized economy, if one government enforces harsher restrictions than another government, a corporation can simply take their business elsewhere, making it a game of which countries are most amenable to a corporation's bottom line needs. Now imagine that we take the government out of regulating business at all and let the market regulate itself, as many small government proponents advocate. And we already know that mega brands would choose the path that leads to short-term profits versus long-term wins for humanity. When left to their own devices, multinational corporations have never chosen people and the planet over profits. It defies the nature of capitalism, which hinges on constant growth. When caring for the earth and its people gets in the way of profits, caring is the first to go. So in any version of this shut up and sell universe, corporations are still political bodies. And once we arrive here, then we realize that should brands be political is the wrong question. The better question that it leads to is, should corporate brands exist? Is capitalism serving us? All of us? Better yet, can capitalism ever realistically serve all of the world's people and the planet? If you answered yes to the last question, I encourage you to think about what circumstances would have to be in place for that to be the case. And then look around at the ticking time bomb that is climate change, pollution, social injustice, and the monumental chasm separating the rich and the poor, and ask yourself, at the rate that we're going, is there even time to make those circumstances come true? If more good people with more money haven't solved our pressing global problems yet, when will they? How will they? When I first made a TikTok about this topic, I led with the idea that we need brands to be political because if we're not, we're all doomed. And I had some interesting discussions in the DMs, many with people who disagreed with me. And you might remember me saying that the metrics that I care most about are the discussions that happen offline after I share something. So I really appreciate these conversations for helping me to think about things in a new way and challenge the TikTokified way we oversimplify complex topics. Those discussions are what pushed me to make this podcast episode and be willing to publicly disagree with myself, which is a skill that I'm practicing. As I often tell my 5-year-old, it's good to do things that we're bad at. One of my favorite people to disagree with on and off the internet is my friend Lee Stein, who always helps me find new answers in better questions. So when I posted this TikTok, she asked, why do you think that brands should be more political? I wonder if we turn to brands because we lose our faith in government. And she's right. It is the government's job to look out for people, not corporations. I sat with this for several weeks as I prepared this podcast episode because I agreed with her disagreement. It isn't the job of corporations to look out for human welfare, it's the government's. No, I don't want more corporations investing in marketing to masquerade as the change when they're anything but. And no, I don't want corporate brands donating to political campaigns and lobbying the government to side with infinite scaling over sustainability. But ultimately where I landed is that as long as we live in this economic system, neither the government nor corporations can both tend to the bottom line and what's best for people and the planet. As long as corporations have more power than the governments we elect, as long as corporate bodies can pick and choose which regulations to abide by, which they can pay off, and which country helps them amass the most profits, as long as corporations can leverage one nation's economic fragility to reinforce another nation's power and wealth, then we live in an oligarchy, not a democracy. And this crisis of faith that so many of us feel isn't about governments versus corporations. It's about all of us versus an economic system that puts profits above all else. So when we ask, should brands be political? And we dare to go down the rabbit hole that this question reveals, we are led to better questions and answers about why exactly this system does not serve our best interests, no matter how you slice it. And yes, our governments should protect us, but they can't as long as capitalism is king. And there has never been a time in capitalism's 500-year evolution when governments have ever protected all of us from its harms. Why are we wasting our time apologizing for a system that only ever finds new and creative ways to hurt us? And that leads us to the final question. What do we do next? Just as I am under no grand illusion that capitalism can be reformed or that governments under capitalism can ever fully protect us from its harms, I'm also under no illusion that there is an easy path to abolishing it. There is no get out of capitalism free card. We can't opt out, jump ship, swim to safety. The most horrifying design feature of this system is that it forces all of us to participate in it. And we all benefit directly and indirectly from exploitation. We just don't see it. For those of us in the USA, the majority of us don't see the global corporations polluting the oceans or our air in our day-to-day lives. We don't see how the energy that powers our homes, our factories, our infrastructure is generated. We don't see the people who make the clothes that hang on store hangers or know how much they were paid or what their life looks like off the clock. We don't see where our trash ends up. We don't watch it seep into our water supply, our soil, our air. What we do see are ads telling us how much the mega brands responsible for all of this are doing to market themselves as part of the solution when they created the problem to begin with. What we do see are politicians blaming our modern problems on us for not doing the right thing or voting for the right people. We see a world shaped around consumption at all costs, and we can't see ourselves living any other way. And because we don't see an easy answer formed in the image of capitalism, an elixir, a 3-step plan, an obvious fix, we convince ourselves that another world is not even worth imagining because we can't see how it would ever come true. So if we're asking, what do we do next? I think one step is to allow ourselves the freedom to think beyond the world that we're living in today. This is why I encourage us, especially those of us who are parents or educators or mentors to young people, to give the next generation the gift of embracing how capitalism is not the best that we can do and how we must do better. We don't need our kids deconstructing what we were too scared to do for them. And I believe that the better world we seek will be built by a version of ourselves that doesn't exist yet. And it won't if we aren't brave enough to let go of knowing all the answers and start living into the questions. I believe that to be an activist today means planting seeds in a garden that we won't see grow and flourish to their full potential. And this is totally contradictory to how capitalism has trained us to seek immediate and personal validation for our efforts. Which leads me to a second step. We need to practice working as a we instead of a me. If none of us individually has the answer, but we do, then part of the work of building towards a better world is getting better at being together, thinking together, celebrating together, grieving together, working together. Capitalism separates us because that's how it thrives. When we see other human beings as competition and barriers to our own survival, we continue to play a game where nobody wins, but everybody thinks they're just about to. We are a society more skilled at buying than being, consuming than collaborating, declaring than doing. Anytime I critique capitalism, people always come back with, well, what will motivate us if not self-interest? But the other way to look at this is the fact that until all of us thrive collectively, none of us can reach our full potential individually. A world that is better for everyone, every one of us, is a world where when we win, we all win. And when we lose, we all lose. And in this world, the greater human interest is inextricably tied to self-interest. And that is a win-win that capitalism can never offer all of us, which is why it's not good enough for me. And it's not good enough for you either. And in that spirit, a third step, embrace the dialectic of deconstructing capitalism while still participating in it. Because there is no 100% ethical or harm-free way of existing within the system. We must still find, earn, make, and spend money, and in between, we must care for and nourish ourselves, seek joy, feed our souls. Raging against the machine 24/7 is just not sustainable. Instead, we must carefully and consciously make compromises every single day. Getting comfortable in the discomfort of knowing that capitalism doesn't really serve us, but we still must operate within it, will help us to continue cultivating community and deconstructing without being seduced back into the lie that, well, this is the best we'll ever get, so why bother building something better? We have to feed our spirits to keep moving forward, or we will fall back into old patterns. And yeah, part of that is finding ways to make money that don't destroy us. So if you're listening to this episode and you run a brand of your own, swap the shame or the guilt that you might feel being forced to participate in this system with the call to carefully choose your compromises. And when you feel exhausted, which we all do and will, let that be your call to rest and reflect, not to give up or give in. And finally, a fourth step. Notice how I don't label these as these steps, but a step, which reminds us that there is no order we must follow or a clear beginning or end to this work. Yes, I believe that we can and must vote with our dollars while we embrace that dialectic of both deconstructing capitalism while continuing to participate in it. But here's the asterisk on that. Multinational corporations are not counting our votes. Corporate brands are oligarchies, not democracies. If you want to make the most of the money that you must spend to live and thrive, whenever possible, vote for a small business. Vote for a local maker. Vote for the brands that put serving over scaling, transparency over tripwires, people over profits. And remember, this, like all of the steps that I suggest here, is an interim measure, not the end goal. And this is the discomfort of that dialectic. We can and must vote with our dollars for the world we live in today while we organize for a world independent of dollars in a future tomorrow. It is both and, not either or. It's a rainbow, not black and white. And so I invite you to live into this rainbow of questions with me as we become the people who will find the better answers together. Should brands be political? I don't know. You tell we. If you want more marketing muckraking and brand strategy gone wild, I invite you to subscribe to this show. And if you enjoyed it, leave me a review. That really helps me out. If you hated it, please send it to your enemies. They sound like good people. You can go to rachelkalbers.com/subscribe to get these updates in your inbox. And because this show is self-sponsored, if you wanted to support my work, you can go to buymearobe.com. That's where the magic happens. In the meantime, remember, it's not the age of the niche, it's the age of the wildcard bitch. See you on the internet.